Hello. We will begin Lecture 3, East Asian Iron Age. China's Shang Dynasty was replaced by the Zhu Dynasty, 1045 to 256 BC. To justify the regime change, the Zhu people claimed that they had received a mandate from heaven. During the reign of the Jiu Dynasty, the Chinese learned how to use iron. Due to certain advantages that iron has over bronze, iron increasingly became preferred to bronze. In studying the Iron Age, we will focus our attention on China's Western Zhu period and the Eastern Zhu period. Confucianism and legalism developed during the Jiu Dynasty. These two philosophies have profoundly influenced not only China, out of which they arose, but all of East Asia. The philosophy that had been more influential is undoubtedly Confucianism, especially in southeastern lands, Korea and Vietnam, that were once ruled by China's Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty lasted from 206 BC to 220 AD, and this dynasty adopted Confucianism as its philosophy. The Zhu Dynasty. The Zhu Dynasty was divided into two phases corresponding to different regions in China where the Zhu ruled, west and east. The Western Zhu Dynasty lived in the western China, from about 1045 to 770 BC. The Western Zhu Dynasty came to an end when the Zhu king Yu banished his wife to marry his concubine. His wife complained to her father, who was a powerful ruler in eastern China. Her father became enraged and set out to punish King Yu. As a result, in 770 BC, the Western Zhu Dynasty fell and was replaced by an Eastern Zhu Dynasty with an eastern capital city. The Eastern Zhu Dynasty lasted from around 770 to 256 BC. The Eastern Zhu Dynasty is in turn divided into two sub-periods, the Spring-Autumn period and the Warring States period. Five influential literary works that in the Han Dynasty were considered the five classics of Confucianism were written during the Zhu Dynasty. They include the Book of Changes, the Book of Documents, the Book of Rites, Book of Odes, and Spring and Autumn Annals. A history of the Zhu Dynasty is contained in the collection of historical documents called the Book of Documents. This work explicitly refers to the mandate of heaven that provides justification for the rise of the Zhu people and the fall of the Shang Dynasty. And you will hear an excerpt from the Book of Documents on the Mandate of Heaven. The Yin Dynasty that the excerpt refers to is the Shang Dynasty. According to the Mandate of Heaven, dynasties such as the Xia and Shang fell because they fell out of favor with the gods who disapproved of the non-virtuous practices of their dynastic leaders. In the previous lecture, you were introduced to the Mandate of Heaven by way of Sima Qian's The Records of the Grand Historian. As Catholics, we believe that the virtuous are not necessarily blessed in this life, but will be blessed in the life to come. Simply because someone prospers in this life does not mean that God favors their way of life, as the Mandate of Heaven seems to indicate. That God allows in this present life the wicked to prosper and the virtuous to suffer at times causes us to resonate with Job's cry, quote, "Why do the wicked live on, reach old age, and grow mighty in power?" Working subtly through history, God, in preparation for the final consummation of the world when Christ will come to judge the living and the dead, orders all things sweetly, as the Book of Wisdom, chapter 8, verse 1 states. We will now read an excerpt from the announcement of the announcement of the Duke of Shao. And it here refers to the Mandate of Heaven. I'll begin. When the work was drawing to completion, the Grand Guardian went out with the hereditary princes of the various states to bring their offerings for the king. And when he entered again, he gave them to the Duke of Zhu, saying, "With my hands to my head and my head to the ground, I present these to his majesty and your grace. Announcements for the information of the multitudes of Yin, that is Shang, must come from you, with whom is the management of affairs. O God, dwelling in the great heavens, has changed his decree respecting his great son and the great dynasty of Yin, that is Shang. Our king has received that decree. Unbounded is the happiness connected with it, and unbounded is the anxiety. Oh, how can he be other than reverent? When heaven rejected and made an end of the decree in favor of the great dynasty of Shang, there were many of its former wise kings in heaven. The king, however, who had succeeded them, the last of his race from the time of his entering into their appointment, proceeded in such a way as at last to keep the wise in obscurity and vicious in office. The poor people in such a case, carrying their children and leading their waves, made their moan to heaven. They even fled away, but were apprehended again. Oh, heaven had compassion on the people of the four quarters. Its favoring decree lighted on our earnest founders. Let the king sedulously cultivate the virtue of reverence. Examining the men of antiquity, there was the founder of the Jiu Dynasty. Heaven guided his mind, allowed his descendants to succeed him, and protected them. He acquainted himself with heaven and was obedient to it. But in process of time, the decree in his favor fell to the ground. So also is it now when we examine the case of Shang. There was the same guiding of its founder, who corrected the errors of Shia, and whose descendants enjoyed the protection of heaven. He also acquainted himself with heaven and was obedient to it. But now the decree in favor of him has fallen to the ground. A king has now come to the throne in his youth. Let him not slight the aged and experienced, for it may be said of them that they have studied the virtuous conduct of the ancients, and have matured their counsels in the sight of heaven. We should by all means survey the dynasty of Xia and Shang. I do not presume to know and say the dynasty of Xia was to enjoy the favoring decree of heaven just for so many years, nor do I presume to know and say it could not continue longer. The fact simply was that for want of the virtue of reverence, the decree in its favor prematurely fell to the ground. Similarly, I do not presume to know and say the dynasty of Shang was to enjoy the favoring decree of heaven just for so many years. Nor do I presume to know and say it could not continue longer. The fact simply was that for many of the virtue of reverence, the decree in its favor fell prematurely to the ground. The king now has inherited the decree, the same decree, I consider, which belonged to those two dynasties. Let him seek to inherit the virtues of their meritorious sovereigns. In the position of king, let him not, because of the excesses of the people and the violation of the laws, presume also to rule by the violent infliction of death. When the people are regulated gently, the merit of government is seen. It is for him who is in the position of king to overtop all with his virtue. In this case, the people will imitate him throughout the kingdom, and he will become still more illustrious. Let the king and his ministers labor with a mutual sympathy, saying, We have received the decree of heaven, and it shall be great as the long-continued years of Xia. Yea, it shall not fail the long-continued years of Yin. I wish the king, through the attachment of the lower people, to receive the long-abiding degree of heaven. The Duke of Shao then, in obeisance, with his hands to his head and his head to the ground, said, I, a small minister, presume with the king's hostile people and all their officers, and with his loyal, friendly people, to maintain and receive his majesty's dread command and brilliant virtue, that the king should finally obtain the decree all complete, and that he should become illustrious. This I do not presume to labor for. I only bring respectfully these offerings to present to his majesty, to be used in his prayers to heaven for its long-abiding decree. End of quote. Along with the Book of Documents, the other four Confucian classics, explains Michael Nyland, as a whole, and I quote for him, occupied in East Asia a position roughly analogous to that of the Bible in the West. End of quote. A main reason why these classics had and still have such a profound influence is that they were used for centuries to test candidates who wished to work in the Chinese government. This Confucian-based civil service exam was officially mandated by Emperor Wu. Emperor Wu ruled from 140 to 86 BC of the Han Dynasty. Not until the founding of the Republic of China in 1912 and the end of China's last dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, was Confucianism decoupled from the Chinese government. Prior to Emperor Wu and his Han Dynasty, Confucianism was not the dominant philosophy. Legalism was. Legalism, interestingly, as we will see, developed out of the teaching of Shunzi, a disciple of Confucius. Confucius lived 551 to 479 BC. Confucius, whom Shunzi identified as his intellectual master, was born in the regional state of Lu during the first sub-period of the Eastern Jiu Dynasty called the Spring and Autumn Period. During the Spring and Autumn Period, powerful families were jostling for power. Feuds between these families were commonplace. In the midst of these tense times, Confucius was able to obtain a minor administrative position in the state government. Eventually, he held the position of Minister of Crime in the state of Lu. In 479 BC, at age 54, he resigned from his office. Confucius drew to himself students who collected and compiled his oral teachings into the Analects. The Analects teach that a well-ordered society needs to be hierarchically based and led by virtuous people. Main virtues that Confucius encourages in the Analects are filial piety, scholarship, and active civic duty. Confucian virtues related to these principal ones are loyalty, honesty, reverence, respect, benevolence, and ritual decorum. When the Spring and Autumn period ended and was replaced by the chaotic Warring States period, the rulers and the people did not look to Confucianism, which insisted rulers needed to be virtuous, but rather to the legalists, who did not assert this principle. They did not hold that the leaders need to be virtuous. According to the legalists, what is important is not the virtue of a leader, but rather the upholding of law. The Ascendancy of Legalism was prepared by the Confucian Shunzi, who we will now look at. Shunzi and Mencius. One way to understand Shunzi, he lived from 300 to 210 BC, with clarity is to contrast him with a contemporary Confucian scholar named Mencius. He lived from 327 to 289 BC. In accordance with Confucian thought, both Shunzi and Mencius valued the virtues of filial piety, education, and active civic duty. They differed in how they understood human beings become virtuous and want to be virtuous. Mencius held that virtue comes naturally to human beings. He asserted, quote, "The goodness of human nature is like the downward course of water. There is no human being lacking in the tendency to do good, just as there is no water lacking the tendency to flow downward." End of quote. In contrast, Shunzi argued that human beings are naturally vicious and self-centered. According to him, quote, "Human nature is evil, and that any good in humans is acquired by conscious exertion." End of quote. Virtue, therefore, needs to be taught and regulated by laws that are to be enforced in a rigorous manner. Otherwise, human beings will easily return to their more natural, vicious, self-centered tendencies, according to Shunzi. Shunzi and Mencius lived during the time of the Warring States period, which was a period of multi-centric civil war between various Chinese states. During these turbulent times, where human life was killed so frequently, Shunzi's pessimistic concept of human nature made more sense to many than Mencius's positive explanation of human nature. What particularly drew people to Shunzi's Confucianism was his belief that enforcing law will bring order. This led to the development of a school of legalism which rose to prominence when the Qin state overthrew the last Zhu king and began its short-lived Qin Empire, lasted from 220 to 206 BC. Legalism. Two important legalists were Lord Shang, died in 338 BC, who worked for the Qin state, and Han Feizi, died in 233 BC. In the book of Lord Shang, that Lord Shang reputedly wrote, quote, "Virtue has its origin in punishment," end of quote. To bring about the maximum amount of virtue, Lord Shang advocated harsh penalties and light rewards. He justified this practice by explaining, quote, "For the more punishments there are, the more valued are rewards. And the fewer rewards there are, the more heed is paid to punishments, by virtue of the fact that people have desires and dislikes." End of quote. Han Feizi, who had been a student of Shunzi, explicitly rejected Confucius and Confucius's emphasis on virtue. Instead, he sided with Lord Shang's legalist view. According to Han Feizi, an effective ruler is to punish with severity, take credit for success, blame his subordinates for failures, and never reveal his nature to subordinates so as to be better able to manipulate them. Legalism and Warfare. One famous work that represents a school of legalism with its emphasis on law, harshly laid down by cunning and deceitful rulers, is The Art of War by Sun Tzu, which we will now look at. This work was likely written around the 4th century BC during the Warring States era. It has been studied with great care by military leaders, politicians, and businessmen. We will now look at a few excerpts from The Art of War. The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Laying plan. Sun Tzu said, "The art of war is of vital importance to the state. All warfare is based on deception. Hence, when able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must seem inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near. Hold out baits to entice the enemy. Feign disorder and crush him. If he is secure at all points, be prepared for him. If he is superior strength, evade him. If your opponent is of choleric temper, seek to irritate him. Pretend to be weak that he may grow arrogant. If he is taking his ease, give him no rest. If his forces are united, separate them. Attack him where he is unprepared. Appear where you are not expected." Sun Tzu said, "In the practical art of war, the best thing of all is to take the enemy's country whole and intact. To shatter and destroy it is not so good. So too it is better to recapture an army entire than to destroy it, to capture a regiment, a detachment, or a company entire than to destroy them. Hence to fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting." Sun Tzu said, "The good fighters of old first put themselves beyond the possibility of defeat and then waited for an opportunity of defeating the enemy. So in war, the way is to avoid what is strong and to strike at what is weak. Therefore, just as water retains no constant shape, so in warfare there are no constant conditions. He who can modify his tactics in relation to his opponent and thereby succeed in winning may be called a heaven-born captain. In war, practice dissimulation and you will succeed." The use of spies, of whom there are 5 classes: local spies, inward spies, converted spies, doomed spies, surviving spies. When these 5 kinds of spies are all at work, none can discover the secret system. This is called divine manipulation of the threads. It is the sovereign's most precious faculty. Having local spies means employing the services of the inhabitants of a district. Having inward spies, making use of officials of the enemy. Having converted spies, getting hold of the enemy's spies and using them for our own purposes. Having doomed spies, doing certain things openly for the purposes of deception, and allowing our spies to know of them and report them to the enemy. Surviving spies, finally, are those who bring back news from the enemy's camp. Be subtle, and use your spies for every kind of business. It is owing to his information again that we can cause the doomed spy to carry false tidings to the enemy. Hence it is only the enlightened ruler and the wise general who will use the highest intelligence of the army for purposes of spying, and thereby they achieve great results. Spies are a most important element in war, because on them depends an army's ability to move." End of quote. A Catholic response to legalism. According to Catholicism, for a human action to be morally good, the moral object must be good, such as telling the truth. It is to be done in the right circumstances, for example, revealing the truth to those who have the right to know, and it must be done with good intentions, ultimately out of love of God and neighbor and not for self-glorification. So, the object needs to be good, the intention needs to be good, and the circumstances need to be good. As the Catholic Catechism of the Catholic Church, the Catechism of the Catholic Church succinctly states, and I quote, "A morally good act requires the goodness of the object, of the end, and of the circumstances together. An evil end corrupts the action, even if the object is good in itself, such as praying and fasting in order to be seen by men. The object of the choice can by itself vitiate an act in its entirety. There are some concrete acts, such as fornication, that is always wrong to choose, because choosing them entails a disorder of the will, that is, a moral evil." End of quote. In light of these 3 sources of morality, the Catholic philosopher Peter Kreeft explains what is wrong with legalism. In so doing, he contrasts legalism with more modern trends of relativism and subjectivism. Legalism defines moral behavior by good actions while ignoring the importance of right intention and fitting circumstances. In contrast, relativism only acknowledges fitting circumstances, and subjectivism only focuses on right intention. Kreeft writes, "A human act must be whole to be good, as a human body must have a whole set of working organs to be healthy. Any one malfunctioning organ can kill you. Thus, defect in any of the three dimensions of morality can make the art act wrong. Or, to use an analogy for the same point, a moral act is like a work of art. If a piece of music is too loud, too long, or too sweet, or too sour, it is defective. Or if a story has unbelievable characters, or theme, or plot, or style, it is a bad story even if its other dimensions are good. Everything counts." God bless.